So welcome back to my channel. So in this, I want to comment on some of the remarks that were made just after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Some of the really vicious, cruel comments by very spiteful people, usually people on the far left, so-called anti-racists, really the race industry, the permanently, professionally outraged. Um, Anti-imperialist bigots, really. And one of the most notable examples was Dr. Ujua Anya. She's a professor of linguistics at Carnegie Mellon University in the United States. So she's a Nigerian American, and she referenced so she referenced things in Nigerian history. So she alluded to that because I think, was her birthplace, and saying that she hoped that the Queen died in agony and so on, that her crown was made up of blood diamonds and so on. Her riches were found in our blood. Now, so it was a really malevolent and thing to say when this 96-year-old woman had just died. So the Queen was born in 1926, and I'm astonished that this Professor Anya could be a professor at all when she's so staggeringly ignorant as thinking the Queen has some sort of political role when she had no political role whatsoever. Now, some of the Queen's defenders said, well, she presided over decolonization. That's true, but the Queen didn't decide to colonize. She didn't decide to decolonize. She didn't decide to maintain colonization for a while. It's nothing to do with her. She did not make these decisions. She was just signed any document that her ministers put in front of her. Her role was that of a rubber stamp. So anyway, and I don't think there's this Professor Anya should be dismissed. And I think people who have the polar opposite view are absolutely entitled to vocalize that and shouldn't lose their jobs either. So anyway, we could go into the rights and wrongs of the British Empire, and sometimes it wrought evil because for a while it ruled about a quarter of the globe. Did it do a quarter of the evil at the time? I mean, I think that's unquantifiable. I don't think so, but there was some hideous acts. The transatlantic slave trade, most notably, an act of the most appalling wickedry, carried on for about 200 years by the British Empire. That's no doubt that that's the case, but the British Empire did not invent slavery. It did more to end slavery than any other force in the world. So the legacy of British imperialism is the abolition of slavery, not slavery itself. And people say, oh, that's partly because there were slave revolts. Well, I think that's actually a fairly minor factor. Yeah, there'd always been slave revolts throughout history. So I don't think that was a major factor in ending. It was some sort of a factor. There was a moral movement. I mean, going back to Nigeria, which Dr. Anya referenced, there was no anti-slavery movement in Nigeria until the United Kingdom ended slavery there. Of course, though the victims of slavery, sure, they wanted to get out of it, but I'm not aware of a large movement to say, no, there's an ethical principle. Nobody should be enslaved. Not me, not my enemies, nobody. Um, anyway, so yeah, sometimes the United Kingdom was certainly in the wrong. And she said that the UK caused millions of deaths in the Nigerian Civil War. Well, the Nigerian Civil War was Nigerians killing Nigerians. No Briton killed a single person in Nigeria at the time. And yes, the United Kingdom recognized the internationally recognized legitimate government of Nigeria and did provide some military guidance, which the Nigerians didn't have to take. And if they hadn't provided such expert advice, the war presumably would have lasted rather longer. It was the people of Biafra who wanted to break away. It was South Africa, it was Rhodesia, it was France that recognized that breakaway. So I thought it was just preposterous to try and heap that one on her. Anyway, goodness, there's been much debate about the abolition of slavery. And of course, England was one of the first countries in the modern world to abolish slavery. England, I said, not the British Empire. 1772, the famous James Somerset case, where the judge, Lord Mansfield, said that there is no slavery in English law, can't exist in England and Wales, but it could exist in the colonies. And you may know that in 1807, the transatlantic slave trade was abolished by the British Empire. Not slavery itself, but abducting people in Africa and conveying them across the ocean was illegal. Those who were already held in bondage in the Antilles and elsewhere remained in slavery. And obviously 1833, slavery abolished, phased out over several years, though there were exceptions. Not abolished in India straight away. Why not? Huge Indian opposition. That's why. So that is imperialism. Yes, that's imperialist interference by emancipating slaves. So, I mean, if this professor thinks that British imperialism is so bad, then she should never read or write a word again in her life, because, of course, there was no literacy in Nigeria till the British Raj came along. Well, we didn't call it British Raj in Nigeria. And yeah, it did bad things. And some of the whites were arrogant. There was some racism involved in this, as there was racism involved in anti-imperialism, as there's racism existed really throughout history in every part of the world, between people of the same color, between people of different colors, and that's distasteful. So it was a really malicious and ignorant argument that she laid out. Anyway, so I'm not sure what the pain and trauma is that sparked this professor to say this. Anyway, she called her the chief monarch of a thieving, raping, genocidal empire. Is finally dying. May her pain be excruciating. Well, what a barbaric thing of her to say. Now, was the empire raping? Well, unfortunately, this vile crime has always existed in every country, shall always exist. I wish it didn't. We can reduce it, like most crimes. It can't be completely eradicated. Um, but the British Empire encompassed hundreds of millions of people at its height, and did some of those commit rape? But no doubt some of them did. I'm not aware that it happened on a significant scale. I mean, any more so than in any other country at any other time. Maybe she could provide some evidence to the contrary. Was it genocidal? I'm not sure what she's alluding to. So the British Empire certainly fought wars, and the first principle of war is to kill the enemy. So yes, soldiers were killed in battle, and then occasionally there were massacres, and obviously that's wrong to do that. Were civilians killed sometimes? Yes, that's true. Deliberately, yes. I'm not sure there was a centrally directed policy of killing the civilians ever, but maybe she could point that out to me. And I know when people were abducted and brought into slavery, other people from West Africa, usually in the West, in the transatlantic slave trade, other countries conquering different West African countries, enslaving people and selling them to British sailors or pirates, perhaps I should say. And some people were summarily murdered when they were found not to be worth transporting across the ocean. So I'm not sure that's tantamount to genocide, but yeah, it's certainly murder. She hasn't substantiated there's any particular examples. There's South Africa, where white Dutch-speaking civilians were interned, or some of them went in there voluntarily because they had a roof over their head, they were fed and so on, or often a tent over their heads. But yeah, a lot of them died in those 2.5 years. There was malnutrition, there was a lack of hygiene, partly because it was a war and supplies didn't often get through. And huge numbers of British soldiers died of the same causes because trains were being blown up and things like that. And some of the black employees of these Boer farmers died in the same way. So yeah, a lot of people died in those concentration camps. Not a single person was killed. They died, that they weren't killed. And I would rather that the mortality rate was much lower. This being 1900 in a war situation, it couldn't be that much lower. No one was forced to work there and things like that. When the Indian Mutiny was put down in 1857, it's true that Britons and their Indian allies did massacre some sepoys they suspected of being mutineers, and some slew some civilians as well, which is appalling. So, although yes, there were atrocities perpetrated by the British Empire, I can't think of anything which comes close to counting as genocide. Obviously, in Ireland, where I come from, we had terrible famine in the 1840s. We were part of the United Kingdom. We weren't a colony at the time, and though we received aid from the government, part of the UK, obviously wasn't sufficient, and about 10% of our population died over 3 years. Some people think that the death toll was rather high, died, and that's attributable to the famine. A lot of people moved abroad. A lot of people moved to Great Britain, the United States, elsewhere, and so food was leaving our ports as well, but wasn't exported by the government. The government didn't control food. The government wasn't even purchasing food. But I don't think it comes anywhere near genocide. Certainly horrific, and this is how some people grieve. They want to point the finger. They want to blame others. Famines have occurred throughout history in every country. It's only really in the 20th century, when agriculture was good enough, that famines stopped occurring. There was one in India in the early 1840s, in 1940s, a rather complicated issue. In Bengal, partly because of the Second World War and deliberately destroying transport, and food aid should have been sent. Wouldn't have saved everybody, but it would have saved some people. At least 2 million people died in the Bengal famine, but that can't be completely laid at the door of the British Raj, because after all, there was an elected government in Bengal at the time. The Muslim League was in charge, and that Muslim League prime minister was later posthumously proclaimed a national hero of Bangladesh. So I think she puts too much culpability onto the British Empire, which does deserve some of it. So when millions, perhaps tens of millions of people served it down the centuries, not surprisingly, there were a few bad ones in there. And some of the British Empire's policies were unfair, were wrong-headed, unsuccessful, and so on. But I thought it was a highly partisan, deeply unfair, misleading, and a grossly, egregiously offensive comment that she made to wish agony on some woman whom even this professor can't think of having done anything wrong. There was the Mau Mau rebellion, which was defeated by mostly black soldiers and police officers in Kenya, white Britons as well, and then Kenya became independent and democratic and so on. And yes, people were killed in this fighting against this insurrection, but sometimes too much force was used. Some suspected insurgents were tortured. That is true. There was a shocking Camp Hola incident, but of all the thousands of people killed in the conflict, I think rather few were killed in captivity through those beatings. I would prefer if it was none. So I thought it was a very unbalanced, distasteful, and dishonest remark that she made, very inflammatory, and reflects great discredit on her cause. Thank you for watching my video. Please subscribe to my channel. Oh yeah, and look what I'm wearing. I bet you wouldn't like that. Goodbye.